Disclaimer. This bonus episode discusses issues relating to children's mental health. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to a Chatting with Casey Children's Mental Health Week special. Episode 1, Why Children's Mental Health Matters. Welcome to Chatting with Casey, the podcast that's all about family, food, fashion, and faith, and travel, and tech, and taking our children's issues seriously today to give them a fighting chance in their adult lives tomorrow. If you haven't been here before, we're doing things a little differently this week with 7 special episodes for Children's Mental Health Week covering 7 different aspects of the issue so that even if you're not directly affected by it, you can at least start forming an informed opinion from the stories we're going to share with you. We wanted to go all over the province to find all sorts of stories from all sorts of communities, and we've accomplished that from Thunder Bay to Ottawa to the Greater Toronto Area and back again. Each region has its own narrative with its own challenges, and you'll hear some of that this week. But let's get to it. We start our series starting with Kimberly Moran, the Chief Executive Officer of Children's Mental Health Ontario, and we chat about the importance of CMHO, what Children's Mental Health Week is all about, and why it should matter to you even if you don't currently deal with any issues head on. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone, for another Children's Mental Health Week conversation. I'm your host, Casey Palmer, and we are chatting right now with Kim Moran, the CEO of CMHO, which is a lot of letters to put together, but basically she is the head honcho behind Children's Mental Health Ontario, which is the organization I'm an ambassador for, and why I've come here to put all this content together for you. So, Kim, how are you?
Oh, I'm terrific. And I'm so happy you're putting this together, Casey, because I know that, there's so many people who care about child and youth mental health. And I think you bringing, interesting conversations to this will only just help an awful lot of people who are thinking about this subject.
For sure. I think I've definitely matured my views on this as I've gone through these conversations, and I feel we're at a point where we talk a lot about mental health in a broad sense of the idea, but we don't perhaps have enough context on a person by person basis as to what that looks like, what's really happening out there, how we can be of help, things of that nature. So it's really helping to add a lot of meat to the skeleton of an idea and helping us to bridge that gap between something that's just so conceptual to like, hey, there are real people going through real things and real stories out there happening.
It's interesting because I think that mental health can be really complicated for people to get their heads around and really simple at the same time, which is really sort of an odd conundrum. But, most everybody will have experienced, as I understand, by the time that they're 43, I heard these stats the other day, a mental health issue. So, mental health issues are commonplace in a lot of ways. And when they say a mental health issue, they don't mean just something small. They mean sort of something that is, I would say serious. And it may just last for a couple of weeks, or it may just last, for a little bit longer than that. But I think that says to everybody that this is an important issue. But I also think that, when I talk about mental health issues for children, there's going to be some people who have in their head, oh, are you just talking really about some anxiety around a test, Kim? Right? Like that's kind of their mental model for this. And I usually always say, well, actually, I'm talking about those kids, but I'm also talking about those kids who are very seriously ill, who have a mental health issue, who might be suicidal, who might be really embarking on a journey for the rest of their lives of struggling with a rather serious mental health issue. So that's why I think it's important to deepen these conversations now, Casey, because I think we have to have a more, nuanced thinking about what we're talking about with mental health. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's really building the context around it so that we get to a point where we're all talking about the same thing and understanding that within that conversation of all everyone talking about the same thing, there's so many different ways that and facets that can kind of splinter off into, because unlike with a lot of things that when it comes to physical health, you can fix a broken leg, you can put a band-aid on something and you pretty much solve the problem. Mental health is so individual and so layered by multiple things that come into the picture, that it definitely spirals off into millions of different stories.
Well, I think that it can be as you know, sort of in our family, we live with this daily. And so it also can mean that somebody who has a more serious mental health issue can have sort of, it can be really in a bad kind of time, or it could be an okay kind of time, and that's all different. And it's different for families to support that. And so that's why I think it's complicated.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's I don't even want to call it a new frontier at this point, but we're at a point where, we are finally starting to have the right conversations about it bit by bit, slowly. It's an iceberg that's floating along the water, and we're again making it happen. But it's a lot different than, even myself growing up a few decades back. It's not something that is as hidden behind closed doors. Now we just have to figure out, with the conversations happening, what do we do with all this? Where do we go next to make this all work?
Yep.
So, Kim, what can Children's Mental Health Ontario, can we just kind of speak to what it does, what it represents, why it's so key towards what happens when it comes down to Children's Mental Health Week?
Well, I think Children's Mental Health Ontario is really the only organization in Ontario that advocates and raises the voice of children and youth and their families to get better mental health services in Ontario. And, I think that better means a couple things. One is around more, because we just don't have enough. We have, 18 to 24 month wait times for kids who have, I would say, quite serious issues. They're waiting for help, and that makes no sense. And the other part would be about making sure that those services they get are high quality. So it's not just enough to have services. We want to make sure they're the right services for kids. And so I look at our organization as being those two things. We spend a lot of time talking to government, because government funds these types of services. And so we spend a lot of time saying to them, it's just not good enough. It doesn't make sense what we're doing now. And we have a plan to improve that.
And I assume that in the role there that, as you go through the conversations, you interface with so many different organizations, individuals who all have a slightly different experience when it comes down to children's mental health.
What's interesting is you're quite right. I mean, there's, families who are struggling with a kid who has very serious issues. There's families that are struggling with kids who have a more mild or moderate issue. I talk to hospitals. I talk to family doctors. I talk to community mental health experts who are delivering treatment every day in communities across the province. I would say that, the thing that I struggle with is that everybody, I think, is kind of aligned in where we need to go, and trying to get the government to sort of get on side and expand services is really been troublesome for us.
There's so much need. The services we have just aren't quite there, especially when it comes down to areas outside of the Greater Toronto area, which is where a number of the conversations we've been having have leaned to. You hear about stories about how you might have individuals in Thunder Bay and they have to go to Southern Ontario to get their services, which for anyone who doesn't live in Ontario, that is a very far distance, just so you know. Ontario is a huge province, and it's so diverse because of that size of the province and the number of different kinds of communities we have here.
I would say that there's problems throughout the province around this, that not even in the GTA, there's issues that make virtually no sense. As ridiculous as this sounds, you can get an appointment for a child and youth with a psychiatrist over telepsychiatry, so online digital kind of platforms, in Thunder Bay faster than you can in downtown Toronto, which is ridiculous, right? But I would say that there are issues layers of issues around how do we get care. And I think it all comes from, though, like right at the base of it is mental health stigma, is that, when healthcare systems were built over the last 100 years, there was a real focus on physical health issues. And I think that generally, if your kid has a physical health issue, it's really well-developed system that you know where to go, you know how to get there,
Right.
and everybody in the system knows. But mental health, when it's first started being talked about was really in the 70s, 80s, and the stigma didn't fall off much later, because remember, for kids, it actually was considered a behavioral issue. Those kids have behavior issues for the most part. And so the science didn't really come forward to say, oh no, that's not a behavior issue, that's a health issue, until even sort of 20 years ago. And so there's been, a big shift. And so I kind of feel like mental health services are kind of behind other physical health services. And but that's shifted now, where parents are saying, actually, no, my kid is ill, right? Like, this isn't just some, behavioral problem. My kid is ill. And certainly when my daughter became very ill, I thought she was ill. It was never occurred to me that this wasn't a health issue. And so I think that that's sort of the underneath what's driving why we just don't have the services that parents and families need and deserve for their kids.
I think I'd agree with that. In that, I went through my own nervous breakdown when I was 16 because I had too much on my plate, and I appreciated back then, there's only I appreciated later on, because as a 16-year-old, I was in the moment. It took me years later to get to the point where I really understood what had got me to that point. And so I find myself not necessarily coddling my children now, who are 3 and 5, more being aware of what their lives are like, what's on their plate, if there's an emotional change, what's happening to them. And I do appreciate as well that, we're seeing a lot more of a focus in kindergarten, for example, when it comes down to mindfulness, or having a more acute awareness of emotional states rather than the rote learning that we used to have in years past. So I feel like I'm seeing, at least in my circles, there's more of a intentionality to build emotionally stable and healthy environments where possible for our kids. But I think it's still, it's one of those things where I know, as a parent, for me, it's like a lifelong journey. It's not something I plan to say, okay, check off these boxes, everything's okay. No, it's something you have to continue to nurture as time goes on.
Parents play such an enormous role, Casey, in creating the foundation for our mental health, right? And so do schools, for that matter. And I would say that you're right. I think there's some really good stuff happening in schools. And I think, for parents, I think that we're all kind of trying, right? Like, I think we're trying to have, I'm going to say, mentally healthy homes. And, one of the programs in schools that one of my colleagues told me about that I thought was so great is that her 4-year-old was super angry with her 2-year-old, right? And they were having this big fight. And her 4-year-old marched off upstairs, and her mom went to see what was going on. And she said, Mom, I am in the red zone. I am going to take some time and calm down to get out of the red zone. And I thought, my goodness, she learned that at school, that, that's about emotional regulation. And that is a skill that, both you and I would know you need all the way through adulthood, right?
100%.
Take a moment. So I think that I was super thrilled about that. And so I think you're quite right. I totally agree with you. I think that the schools are doing a good job in sort of incorporating some of this mental wellness, I will say, into curriculum. And I think parents are also doing their best to think about that, to think about emotions and think about emotional health. It is a fine line not to coddle, right? And, certainly having a child with a mental illness myself, every single day I'm thinking, okay, am I coddling? Am I helicoptering? Am I, am I on the right side of this? Right. And that's always a constant battle parents have.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. But I think the mystery of parenting is that you often don't know what you did or what happened until, way down the road. In the moment, I think it's best to just try your best to keep navigating, keep being open and have those conversations so that we can hopefully, do the right things by our children. And always, my number one thing that I want the kids to remember as they go out into the world is that I can't live their lives for them, but I want them to know that they have a safe environment they can come back to at the end of the day if they need to talk anything through, or just know they're loved and that they don't, have to worry about being judged as much, if you will, for being them. Thanks. So I think you're in a unique position to answer this question for me. Kim, I've asked it to most people, but I think you've definitely been in the trenches and you can maybe see it from a different angle. So I've asked everyone, what can those of us who aren't necessarily being as impacted by the children's mental health issue at this time. So let's say we have, young children like myself, or, you let's say think you have a quote unquote normal family where there's no issues at hand or what have you. What can those individuals do to support people who are currently going through the struggle or currently having to deal with issues? And is there something that we should be more aware of as we go into the uncertainty of the future?
Well, I think that there's a couple things. One is, I think you touched upon it, is really being deliberate and conscious about having mentally healthy homes, right? And mentally healthy communities. And that goes to sort of, if you see, if you sort of employ the techniques in your own home with your own family, that's one piece of it. But the other is, do you see children or young people around your community that need help, right? And reaching out to them and trying to help them. And, obviously because of my interest in mental health, I'm like a magnet in our community. Yes. But I also think that's really important, right? Like, I think it's important work that I can do, like like for example, a family friend, I was going to say young boy, but it makes me sound old because he's actually a teenager. He stopped myself for a minute. His mother has quite serious mental illness, and so his mom went through a problem, and so he needed a place to stay. And or he didn't ask for that. I said, "Listen, why don't you come stay with us?" But clearly there was some big stuff happening in his house, and so I think that reaching out your hand to other kids who might be struggling for whatever reason. I often find out of here in Toronto, and often sometimes my kids' friends who come from immigrant backgrounds, there's sometimes a struggle there because sometimes their parents aren't. Mental health isn't something that's always talked about regularly in cultures, and they feel. They feel uncomfortable, so they'll come and talk to me, and I usually try and get them help. So I know that at child and youth mental health centers across the province, that you don't need an OHIP card to come in, and that often is a big issue for kids because their parents might have their OHIP card, or you don't have to go to your family doctor first, because often kids will say, "Oh, I don't want to because my parents go there." Now, realistically, family doctor has all kinds of confidential communications with parents, but kids don't often believe that. So be able to send them to a child and youth mental health center that they can see in a walk-in kind of environment just changes everything for them. And for anybody listening, just so you know, you can go up on our website at cmho.org and you'll see a list of them there. And so I would say reach out to kids and keep your ear tuned. And when you hear from your kids that somebody's struggling, like step in, lean into that, right? And help them. That's I think what as a community we should be doing. Mm-hmm. Now, I think on a broader level, we are trying to keep the pressure up on government to really expand services, because we really believe that mental health services should be easily available and nobody should have to wait for them. And on our website, like I said, please join us, because we'd love to have more people helping us advocate to make sure that services are available.
I think that's all totally fair. I think we just need to really continue to push the envelope as a community to make sure everyone is aware of the issues and doing what they can to build that better tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Kim, thank you for their time. I appreciate it. I feel like there's a lot for people to chew on here, which is a good thing. And yeah, we'll just make sure to keep it going. I know we have. I'm going to probably when people hear this, it's going to be the beginning of Children's Mental Health Week, so everything's going to feel out of sync. Everyone who's listening, but you'll get there. It'll work out. When you see the page, it'll all come together. It'll connect. You will love it. I promise. But Kim, thanks again for your time.
Well, thank you, Casey, for putting this together. I really appreciate it.
All right. And like I said, everyone, if you need to get more Children's Mental Health Week content, do check out the links that are just below this podcast you're listening to right now. You'll understand when you see it all laid out in front of you. And if anything else, make sure you check out cmho.org because there's lots of info there too. All right. Thanks, all. And there you have it. There's a lot we can all do to make a better world for children's mental health, and hopefully we all get a little more intentional in everything we do for our children, because every moment counts. Make sure to hit the link in the show notes and check out cmho.org for even more Children's Mental Health Week content, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story from another lens of the issue. Be well out there, and this is Casey Palmer signing off.